Right, so back at Elstree in our trusted Jet Ranger. Last time we had a look at effects of controls and speed and power changes, and this time we're going to look at climbing, straight level, climbing and descending. So we're sat on the runway, we'll get airborne, we'll head out on what is Route Bravo, climb up to about 1,000 feet, and then we'll run through some speed changes. So we need a couple of instruments, airspeed indicator here, altimeter here, vertical speed indicator here, and our power gauge just here. We also have our balance indicator on the window, and we're going to use that one and not the one down here, because if we look at this one we won't be able to see what we're doing. Right, let's get going. First takeoff of the day, you know it's going to be ropey. We're up, haven't stopped talking, it's all good. Hopefully you can hear me alright. Background noise isn't too loud. If anyone's in chat, if the helicopter noise is too loud, just let me know. Right, let's head out on Route Bravo. Transition away, accelerating on the ground to about 40 knots, 45 knots. And then we'll let the nose come up. Looking for about 60 knots in the climb. Power lines, and we'll head out on Route Bravo, away from Elstree. So on the last one, we were looking at speed changes. We weren't really concerned with whether or not the aircraft was going up or down because we're changing our speed. So now what we're going to try and do is fly the aircraft level so it's not going up or down at particular speeds, and then speed up and slow down without the aircraft going up or down. So we're going to have to coordinate our power as well as our pedals. So we're at 1,000 feet now. What I want to try and do is fly at 60 knots. So remember, we need to look out to the horizon and get the attitude right for 60 knots. But the aircraft's going to start to climb. You can see it on the VSI, we're starting to go up. So let's just get it back on the numbers. What we need to do first of all, we do attitude power trim. So we raise the nose slightly for the attitude and reduce power at the same time, trying to maintain a slightly higher nose attitude without the aircraft going up, as we search for the right attitude for 60 knots. Looks about right. Tiny bit further nose down. And now we're starting to descend slightly, so we need a little bit more power, maintaining the attitude. Power. There we have 60 knots, straight and level, not going up or down. And so we now know that a rough guide, about 40% torque, is giving us 60 knots. We're now going to slow down to 40 knots, so we raise the nose. Horizon down, and as the aircraft slows down it's going to want to climb, so we reduce power a little bit further, maintaining that new attitude. power adjustments and yaw adjustments as required. And the aircraft is now straight level 40 knots. Once we have the attitude, we might need a little bit more power as the aircraft has stopped slowing down. And there we are, level at 40 knots. And if you want to speed back up again, we'll go back up to 60, so we lower the nose. A bit of power so it doesn't sink. As we increase power, we need a little bit more forward pressure to maintain the new attitude. And there we are, back at 60 knots. Once we've got it stabilised, quick check to the power. Yep, we've got a little bit too much. We're climbing. Just fine tuning to get our 60 knot attitude and the right power setting. Which in the simulator world, we haven't got to worry about real world physics quite so much. Should be exactly the same power setting that we had before. Okay, there we go, and now we're going to push it up again, and we're going to push the speed up to 80 knots. So we're going to push the nose down, increase the power, hold the new attitude, make any corrections for your string still straight upright. And the secret to doing accurately is to do it slowly. There we go, there's 80 knots, and now we're just trimming, which is basically making small adjustments to hold the speed, stop the aircraft from climbing or ascending. So actually this is quite realistic in the sense that I'm having to make constant little corrections to try and get the speed that I want and the power setting correct, which is exactly what you do in the real world. You're constantly making small little corrections on all the controls to make the aircraft do what you want to do. It's a bit easier in the stuff that I fly because it's got stability systems which make all those little adjustments for you, and you can basically sit there with your arms crossed and let the aircraft do the work. But in a basic helicopter like a Jet Ranger or a Robinson, this is what you get, constant little corrections to try and make the aircraft do what you want it to do. So those are your speed changes. The next thing we'll look at is climbing. So for climbing, in the real world, you need to have a good look above you to make sure you're not going to climb into anything. And then the mnemonic you use for climbing is attitude power trim, and we're going to climb at 60 knots. So we reselect an attitude for 60 knots. That will immediately start the aircraft climbing. If we're not already, we increase our power to maximum continuous, making whatever pedal adjustments are required, and then we're trimming again. We're maintaining the 60 knots, we're maintaining the balance with our feet, and we're keeping the power around about max continuous. And there we are in the climb. We're going to climb and level off at 2,000 feet. To level off from our climb is the same mnemonic, attitude power trim. So we'll start leveling off before we get to 2,000 feet, otherwise we'll go through it. So about 100 feet before, just push the nose forward, looking for our 80 knot attitude again. Once we've got our 80 knots, aircraft is still climbing slightly, we'll let it hit 2,000 feet, and then we'll reduce the power, trying to maintain our 80 knot attitude as we reduce power. go. Now straight level, 2,000 feet, 80 knots. So for descending, it's the same principle but in a slightly different order. So rather than using apt, we use pat, which is power attitude trim. So before we start, good look beneath us so we don't descend onto anything. There's nothing out here, but in the real world there might be other aircraft. Depending on what you're flying, you may need to configure your engine for a descent, such as using such things like carb heat. But in a Jet Ranger, you haven't got to worry about it. And so we're going to reduce power first, so lever down, reducing power. The nose is going to want to drop, so we need to pull the nose back up once we've got a descent, stop it from dropping. And we're now looking for our 60 knot attitude as we're coming down. Again, do it all nice and gently so you can overcome all the secondary effects of the controls. There's our 60 knot attitude. Different aircraft have different power settings for descending, but anywhere between about 500 feet and 1,000 feet a bit down, it's absolutely fine. And we're going to go down to 1,000 feet. A couple of hundred feet before you get to the level you want, you need to configure your engine again. So if you're in a Robinson, that would be carb heat away. You want the aircraft back into its cruising configuration. And then it's the same mnemonic again, power attitude trim. So about 100 feet before we get there. Increase the power. Start pushing forward for that 80 knot attitude. Trimming, so don't go through the level we want, so more power. And there we are, 80 knots, level 1,000 feet. So we've come out all the way to Enfield. Actually, I flew over this 4 times yesterday in the real world, and there should be a video on YouTube. It doesn't cover this bit, but it was that flight. So we'll turn around, head back towards the airfield. As we make the turn, monitoring the instruments to make sure we maintain our altitude. We might need a little bit of back pressure. We might lose a little bit of speed in the turn. Depends how aggressively we turn. Now this exercise in the real world is very much one of practice. Getting used to the different attitudes for the different speeds, the different power settings your aircraft needs for level flight in those conditions, and just coordinating the controls as you do it. The key thing is just to do it slowly. Get used to what's moving where, and repetition will make you better at it. So let's go back up to 2,000 feet. So good look up, which I'm not going to do because the aircraft will go all over the place, but the real world have a good look up. Attitude first for 60 knots. Aircraft starts to climb. Increase the power. Try and overcome the secondary effects of your power increase. And then trimming for your 60 knots. Balance indicator in the middle. Which is our string, don't forget. The aircraft likes to do a lot of sideways flying with a high power setting. I think that's where the crabbing effect is coming from. Okay, 100 feet before we get there. 80 knot attitude. And then reduce power. so as not to box the level. And then we're just trimming it out badly to try and maintain our 80 knots, 2,000 feet as we're cruising along. Let's take it back down to 1,000 feet. So it's power attitude trim. Good look beneath you, configure the aircraft for the descent, reduce the power as the aircraft starts to sink, raise the nose, looking for your 60 knot attitude. And then we're trimming it, maintaining our 60 knots. Rate of descent's quite high, so we'll get a little bit more power. Take it back down to 1,000 feet. So with a couple of hundred feet to go, reconfigure your aircraft for straight level flight. To go, power attitude trim, increase the power, start pushing the nose forward, changing the attitude back for 80 knots. Yeah, that looks about right. Tiny bit too high, tiny bit too fast. Now in the training world, you're expected to fly the aircraft very close to the speed that you've designated. So if you told the person, the instructor, the examiner, whatever, that you're going to fly the aircraft at 80 knots. They're expecting you to fly the aircraft at 80 knots as accurately as possible. However, they're also expecting you to maintain whatever altitude that you've designated. Now when you're flying in the real world, as you're flying through the various air currents, the aircraft will go up and down with the various air currents. What you want to do is to try and correct the aircraft every time it climbs and descends in the simplest and easiest way possible. The simplest way to stop the aircraft from going up and down with a bit of turbulence is to change the attitude ever so slightly to stop it from climbing or descending. And you can see here that I'm making very small corrections to make the aircraft go up or down a little bit on airspeed to maintain the level I want. But what you have to be very careful of is that you don't change your speed by more than about 5 or 10 knots. And the reason I'm doing that rather than using the collective up and down is so I don't get all the secondary effects of pitch and yaw associated with power changes. I don't want to be hunting around constantly with my power to try and get the right setting to stop the aircraft from going up or down. You will, on really windy, bumpy days, have to make power changes to stop the aircraft from climbing in a straight line or descending. But you want to try and move the controls as little as possible. Once you've got out of the training environment and you're in the real world, what you tend to then do is set the maximum continuous power that your aircraft has and fly at whatever speed that gives you. Like I said, in the training world and the testing world, they're looking for you to fly the aircraft as accurately as possible. So this technique is more appropriate to a commercial flight when they're looking at you to get it from A to B as quickly as possible, and not sort of private pilot level. What you'll end up doing as a private pilot when you're training is that you'll end up flying everywhere at a set speed. For Robinsons it's usually about 80 knots, and you'll learn what power setting gives you about 80 knots, and then you can make small adjustments around that power setting. And here we are sitting at 80% torque, and that's giving us about 120 knots. Still flying at 1,000 feet. What I'm doing now is we're cruising along, so I'm completely ignoring the power, the collective, and I'm flying it very much like an aeroplane. This is how, in the real world, if you watch any of the videos, this is how I fly the aircraft. And everybody flies their aircraft. They set the power setting that they want, they fly the aircraft at the speed that it gives them, and they make the little corrections in pitch to stop the aircraft from going up or down. But I say in the training world, you'll need to demonstrate that you can fly the aircraft at a set speed, at a set height, and on a set heading. So when you're correcting for power changes, you've got to try and make sure the aircraft doesn't turn at the same time. So it's all about looking out the window of the aircraft and not so much at the instruments. It says as it goes up a little bit. So having a feature to follow, like a motorway or a road, is quite useful. So if we slow the aircraft down now, all the way back to 60 knots, try not to let it climb while we're doing it, and we'll try and maintain the motorway as we're flying along. And again, the slower you do it, the easier it is to overcome all those secondary effects. When you're flying quickly, the aircraft will have a lot of energy in it. So if you suddenly try and slow down, all of that energy's got to go somewhere, which is why you'll tend to balloon up and as you try and slow down. So you need to try and do it as slowly as you can to begin with. Once the energy starts to bleed out of it, the speed slows down. You can then do things a bit quicker. So there we are, back at 60 knots, still at 1,000 feet. We're coming up to the M25 M1 junction. Luton Airport off to the right, Salt Hanger left, and we'll head back to Elstree down the motorway. And what you should be getting at the end of each flying lesson in the real world is a little bit of hovering practice, just to give you a rough idea of what's involved when you're hovering, and get your brain thinking about what the controls are doing when you're hovering. For me, hovering in the real world is easier than the game world, and that's because I'm so used to picking up all my visual cues from my peripheral vision, and also what my bum's feeling. In the simulator, you don't get the depth perception. Let's just speed up again a little bit. But we'll have a little play of hovering when we get back to the airfield. Try not to embarrass myself. My real world helicopter has the SAS, which works in the hover just as well as it does in full flight, so I can even take my hands and feet off when I'm hovering. That'll be Watford on the right. This junction will be the A41. A1, M1 junction. There's the lake next to Elstree. Last time we came in a bit high and fast, so we'll start slowing down early. Alright, once we've got the thing established in the descent, we can start to ignore our instruments. As we get close to the ground, we want to try and maintain a constant ground speed, so as we get closer and it looks like we're going faster, we just keep slowing down with the aim of a steady walking pace when we get down to about 5-10 feet. Terrible posture in my chair, my flight chair, in my chair. And let's finish off